Hello, this is Chef John from foodwishes.com with lemon drizzle cake. That's right, this is one of the tastiest, easiest cakes ever. And don't just take my word for it. Mary Berry says the same thing. And I should know, because this is basically her recipe that I've adapted a little bit. And if you're someone that doesn't make cakes because you don't like all those steps and techniques, then you've come to the right place. Since all we're going to do here is dump a bunch of stuff in a bowl and mix. So with that, let's go ahead and get started by dumping a bunch of stuff in a bowl, starting with a little touch of white sugar, and then over that, we will grate the zest from 2 lemons. And as you probably know by now, all that beautiful fragrant lemon flavor really comes from the zest. And if we wanted to, we could just grate this in and then continue on with the rest of the ingredients. But you know me and my optional steps. So what I'm going to do, and what I hope you do also if you have time, is that after this is grated in, we will give it a mix, and then we'll let it sit for like an hour, or even a half hour would be fine. And what will happen is that sugar is going to draw out all those oils, which I really do think improves the flavor. And if you need some proof, go try our State Fair lemonade recipe, where we use the exact same technique there, which by the way is called oleosaccharum, which means oily sugar. But anyway, like I said, this is optional, so you decide. I mean, you are, after all, the Evelyn Rose of how this recipe goes. And in case you're wondering, that's the woman credited with inventing this recipe. So after mixing, I did let mine sit for 1 hour before I continued on with the rest of the ingredients, which will include some self-rising flour, plus a little extra baking powder, and definitely a nice pinch of salt. And then before we add the rest of the ingredients, let's go ahead and give that a quick stir. Oh, and don't worry if you can't find or don't have self-rising flour. In the written recipe, we always tell you how to make your own, which is basically just done by adding some baking powder to all-purpose flour. And once we've given that a quick mix, we can go ahead and add our butter, which has to be pretty soft. Okay, the only way to make this incredibly easy recipe hard is to try to use some cold, stiff butter. And that's it. We'll finish up with 4 whole eggs, plus a little splash of milk. And we'll get in there with our electric mixer, or a whisk, if we're into a little bit of a workout. And we will mix this, starting off slowly at first. And then once everything starts to come together, we can turn our speed up to high. And we will continue mixing this until it just comes together, and we're looking at a light, fluffy batter. Which, if your butter is nice and soft, will only take like a minute. But if your butter is cold and hard, it will take way longer than that. And there's a good chance you'll be wearing some of the batter, because those hard pieces of butter will be flying everywhere. But anyway, like I said, we will mix that until we have a nice, light, fluffy batter, which hopefully looks something like this. And once that's set, we can transfer that into our prepared loaf pan. And by prepared, all I mean is that we lined our pan with a couple buttered pieces of parchment paper, okay, one going across the middle and one going from end to end, which is going to make it a lot easier to remove our cake. And that's it. Let's go ahead and take our batter and transfer it in. And as we do, let's make sure we're pushing that spatula into the corners so that we don't get any big pockets of air. And by shaking the end of that spatula back and forth, it will kind of wiggle the batter, which will basically have the same effect. And then once that's been transferred in and we've cleaned off our spatula, before it goes in the oven, we will give it the old shaka-shaka, plus definitely a few old tappa-tappas to make sure everything's nicely settled down. And that's it. Our cake is now ready to transfer into the center of a 350-degree oven for about 50 minutes or so, or until a wooden skewer stuck in the center comes out clean. And while our cake is baking, we can go ahead and make our lemon drizzle, which is really the key to the whole operation. And all we need to do for that is add some sugar to a bowl, and then pour in the juice from those 2 lemons we zested. And then we'll take a whisk and start whisking, and we will keep whisking until that sugar dissolves, and we've created what is basically a lemon syrup. And I'm sure you're going to do a thorough job with this, but just to hedge our bets, before we pour this over the cake later, we can go ahead and give it another whisking just to be safe. And that's it. By now our cake should be done. And as you can see, it's baked up to a beautiful golden brown. So it does look done, but we have to test it anyway. And like I said, if you stick a skewer in the middle and it comes out clean, it's done. And then what we'll do is just let this sit and rest for 5 minutes before we grab our skewer again since we want to poke this cake all over. And while it's probably pretty obvious, what these holes are going to allow is for our drizzle to get down into the cake, since we want full penetration, as well as complete permeation. So we'll go ahead and pierce that all over, all the way down to the bottom, at which point we can take our lemon drizzle and start ladling it over the top. And I guess if you wanted, you could just pour it from the bowl. But I feel like a ladle gives us a little more control, and maybe allows for a little more even saturation. But if I'm being honest, I think I just like to do it this way because it takes longer. And it's sort of part of the meditation and the ritual, which has value that goes way beyond anything practical. And that's it. Once our cake has been thoroughly drizzled, we have to let it sit and cool down all the way to room temp. At which point, in a perfect world, we wrap it up and we pop it in the fridge overnight before we serve it. Okay, I really do think this is better if we age it for a day. But at the very least, let it cool all the way down. And once it is cool, we can go ahead and remove it from the pan, which thanks to those 2 pieces of parchment is going to be very easy. And then pro tip, before you transfer this onto whatever platter you're going to serve it, make sure you've loosened that parchment paper underneath so that that comes off nice and easily. Because if you don't, it might stick a little bit, like this. And since the cake is not chilled and still pretty fragile, it could break. But happily mine didn't. And then in real life, just go ahead and slice this and start eating. Okay, I decided to add a little more icing to the top that I did with some powdered sugar and more lemon juice, since I sort of wanted some visible drizzles on the top for the pictures. Except as soon as I squirted that on, it soaked right into the cake and sort of disappeared. But that was fine, because it actually did help stick on the next thing I garnished with, which are some beautiful lemon zest curls that you have to have this special zesting tool to do. But I do, so I did. And I went ahead and scattered those over the top, which I will edit, since that took me about 20 minutes to arrange them exactly how I wanted. But it was totally worth it, because check it out. And like I said, I really do like to refrigerate this before I slice in, but I really wanted to taste some, so I sliced a piece off the end, which of course is going to be the least moist and tender piece. But if this end piece is amazing, which it was, you know those beautiful center cut pieces are going to be even more incredible. So I took a few bites and was extremely happy. And then I plated up a real piece from the center, and I garnished it so everyone could tell I went to culinary school in the early 80s. And that, my friends, for such an incredibly simple cake to make, really is fantastic both texturally and taste-wise. All right, it's sweet, of course, but not too sweet. Plus, we are getting both kinds of lemon flavor. Okay, that intense, fragrant lemon flavor from the zest, plus that bright, acidic lemoniness from the juice. So this really is my favorite all-time lemon cake. In fact, it might just be one of my favorite cakes. Oh, and if you think we used a lot of that lemon drizzle in this recipe, we really didn't. Okay, compared to some recipes that are pretty much fully saturated with the syrup, this would be considered on the dry side. But that is definitely a relative term, since there is nothing dry about this cake. And if you did want to soak it with more of that lemon drizzle syrup, go ahead. And sometimes instead of calling this lemon drizzle cake, I'll call it lemon drizzle loaf. Because obviously, loaves have less calories than cakes. So just a little bit of branding advice as we finish up. But whether you call this a loaf or a cake, this is definitely something you're going to want to bake. Which is why I really do hope you give this a try soon. So please follow the links below for the ingredient amounts, a printable written recipe, and much more info as usual. And as always, enjoy.